Hey guys, David here. Figured I'd give you something a little bit informal and quick today, a wrap up of how my year's been going so far in regards to reading. There's been a bit of an absence. I think in one of the last videos I made I said had a lot of ideas in the works, but the virus kind of fucked that up. And I'll give you a super quick little update just of how that happened, and then I'll jump into the books. Shouldn't take too long. But as I mentioned briefly in previous videos, I'm part of a family-owned business, and we are in the wedding and event industry. So one of the first things to go once the outbreak started happening was any gatherings. Our state in particular, on March 12th, had a ban on events more than 10 people. So we went from one of our best years on record to being 95% down in revenue. And we had to navigate the waters moving forward because realistically, we're not getting any better before fall. We secured loans and everything, but in the time that it took to do that, it was really, really stressful. I was battling a little bit of depression, definitely near future anxiety, and all the noise that comes with that. So I did about a month and a half of not reading at all. In the past 2 or 3 weeks, I've been reading a good bit more. And I'm still behind. I think I'm supposed to be at 20 books right now, and I think I'm at 17 or 18. But yeah, let me show you what I've read so far. We'll go over everything chronologically since the beginning of the year. A few of these you'll have seen already. Most of them you haven't. And I'm going to be quick about the definitions on these books and the descriptions and whatnot. Basically try to give you a feel for what the books are about. Some of these I'm going to be covering in other videos, reading by topic and then reading by author. So you can expect to see more of some of these, probably about half or so, more in depth in upcoming videos. So without further ado, let's jump in. So firstly, I had an audiobook to start the year. I've been using Overdrive, which is an app that you can get that links to your library, and you can put books on hold and then get the audiobook version without actually having to go in, and it's free, so Audible but better. The choice is a little bit more limited because it's based off of what your network of libraries has in stock, so the range isn't quite as good. But I found this one. It's called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard, and I believe it was originally published in French, and if I remember correctly, it's been a little bit since I read it, but it's more of a literary critique type of thing. When I picked it up, I wasn't sure what I was getting into. I thought it was going to be more about books as a whole, how books are written, and how to talk about it if you don't know what's in the book itself, how to have conversations related around books. But that wasn't what this was. So the argument in this book is actually saying that you probably shouldn't be reading books because it's a waste of time, and it can actually bring you further away from what the book's actually trying to talk about. And he references a librarian who, the more time he spends reading books, the less time he spends familiarizing himself with the catalog and knowing which books stand in relation to other books. And it's weird. It's definitely interesting, but it's weird. Yeah, it's mainly arguing to get the essence of a book, but without reading the book itself. I guess I would recommend it. It was interesting. I didn't love it, but it was fairly short, and I got through it fast. Next up, we have Juvenescence by Jim Mellon, and this is an interesting one. I gotta stop using that word. But this is written from the perspective of somebody telling you what to invest in. But that's not the reason I really love this book. So what it does is it talks about longevity and life extension technologies in the realm of investing. But in order for him to make investment advice for you and let you know which companies are doing what technologies and what scientists are working on what, he has to explain to you what is going on. What are the technologies? What's the mechanism? How likely are these to be a success? And it is a gorgeous book. It has tons of images, breakdowns, just everything. And it's all in layman's terms. So I really think this is a super good book to get you familiarized with the technologies that are being worked on in relation to bodily upkeep and longevity. Then we get to How Not to Die by Michael Greger. And this book basically tackles 15 major causes of death in America and how to prevent them. It mainly talks about plant-based diets and not eating meat, as well as what nutrients come from different plants and what you can get out of your diet. And it's a chunk of a book, and it's a hell of a lot of statistics. It does get dry at times, but the man knows what he's talking about. I did skip around a little bit. I ended up reading the whole thing, but sometimes I couldn't force myself to get through like a full chapter without just zoning out due to the wall of statistics and whatnot. But if you can get yourself to read through the whole of this book, I think it is probably the best way to give yourself cognitive dissonance about eating meat and unhealthy food. Like, it will drill into you how bad stuff is. So by the time you finish this book, every time you look at like a piece of red meat or something, there'll be a little bit of you drawing away. That all being said, he doesn't come from like a moral high ground where he's telling you like not to eat a lot of these meats and other crappy foods. It's strictly scientific, so it's much easier to digest, especially if you don't like fully agree with like the moral argument of it. Not saying that I don't agree with it, but I like that it comes from the more scientific approach versus a moralistic argument. Then we had The Pearl by John Steinbeck. This is my first Steinbeck, and my first work of fiction of the year. Yeah. But maybe since I'm not a fan of fiction, like I didn't appreciate it for all it is, I liked it, but it was just a story to me. It was very obvious, like, they were trying to tell the story about how this pearl corrupted this man's entire life when he came into wealth, even though he needed the wealth in the first place. And it's very obvious that that was the line of thinking with the book. And he used very colorful language. It was like playing a movie the entire time through my head. But when I put it down, I didn't want to read more fiction or more Steinbeck at all. I guess I'd rate it like 3 out of 5 stars. It was pleasurable while I was in it, but it didn't leave me wanting more. And again, maybe that's just me not being a fiction writer, but you might like it. Next up, one of my favorites so far, Lifespan by David Sinclair. So David Sinclair is a PhD out of Harvard, and he studies genetics, I believe. And this is his informational theory of aging. To describe it super quickly, and this will be a test for me. Basically, he's saying damages to like sirtuins that modulate the epigenome accumulate like scratches on a CD for reading the DNA, and that accumulation over time is what causes aging. The full theory is laid out within the first 70 pages of the book. In total, there is about 350 pages. So the remainder of the book goes on to talk about different experiments he's working in his lab, as well as his thoughts on aging, both moralistic and in a scientific point of view. And yeah, it's a really solid book. It was just published last year, and if you're into longevity, this is definitely one to pick up. You'll see this covered more in a later video. Alright, next in order are the 3 I read in Honduras. So there's a more fleshed out video of this, the last one I made actually. So if you want a little bit more about these, you can go to that one. First we have The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery. And this book was written more of a memoir than a deep dive into like theories of consciousness. I liked it, but it wasn't what I was looking for when I picked it up based off the title. More thoughts in the other video. Then we had The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This was really fun. So it's my second work of fiction and the last fiction I've read so far this year out of 18 books or whatever it is. Basically, it's an exquisite corpse, which means they took a segment out of a piece of art and played off of just that segment. So the last piece of the puzzle was The Deep, the song by Clipping, David Diggs. David Diggs? Yeah, David Diggs. Or David Diggs, sorry. But it's like an experimental rap song. Super cool, love the vibe. Has really cool themes in it, so it's basically the descendants of slaves that were thrown overboard that turned into mermaids, and they share a collective consciousness that the burden is all on one person, the main character. The whole book is written from the perspective of that individual, and it purposefully does not use any pronouns, I believe, through the entire book. So it's a really cool concept, kind of artsy, definitely a lot to dig into. I really enjoyed it. Thirdly, we had Drawdown, and this is by Paul Hawken. And this is basically, I think, 100 techniques to get carbon and greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. How to draw it down. And super in-depth, super easy to engage with. Every, 2 pages is a new topic. It's got tons of illustrations, and it provides hope. It actually gives you something to go after if you want to make a change, like with the climate. Then we had Being Mortal. Now, this is a book kind of pretty heavy. It's all about death. And I've seen a lot of people recommending it to family members that are approaching troubling medical scenarios. It's written in a similar way to When Breath Becomes Air, and that it's slightly memoir style, where it relates to the author of the book. And basically, I forget the exact relationship, but it's either his grandfather or father or some person in kin to him that is diagnosed with a potentially terminal medical disease, and it goes through basically the prioritization of what is most valuable in life and what risk to take and which ones not to take. I do believe, and echoing the thoughts of others, that it is a very important book to give to a relative who's facing a similar situation, or to read yourself to address these important questions that might be hard to breach in conversation otherwise. Then, something a little lighter. I really need to get exposure down. Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. So, a little on the lighter side, basically is all about the 10,000 hour rule. Not only that, but how people were positioned correctly to take advantage of the expertise they built up. Really good read. I'll cover this more in another video. One completely about Malcolm Gladwell. And then we had Range by David Epstein. And I read this back to back with Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers on purpose, because Outliers delves into the 10,000 hour rule and basically saying, you want to set up and be an expert on X subject if you want to succeed. Range, on the other hand, used the comparison of Tiger Woods and then Federer, the tennis player, to talk about how there's multiple paths towards the same goal. It used Tiger Woods as a 10,000 hour example, where he was born and raised since I think age 6 on the golf course and became one of the greatest of all time, to Federer, who played basically every sport under the sun, however, still in that same ballpark of sports, but then chose tennis and then became one of the greatest of all times. So it's super interesting and shows how a diverse background can be just as good, if not better, than spending 10,000 hours on one spot. Something I would recommend reading. Then we get to The Third Wave by Steve Case. Steve Case is one of the co-founders of AOL, and this book was written in his own description as a way to prepare the next wave of entrepreneurs. Basically how to prepare for the Internet of Things and an entirely interconnected world. However, that's not really why I loved the book. The most valuable part of the book for me was kind of like a behind-the-curtain peek at AOL and its beginnings. I thought that was way more interesting than what the intention of the book was supposed to be, even though that part was only really written to prop up the next section and basically tell you why he was qualified and how to apply what he learned. But yeah, I think it's fairly short read if I remember correctly. Had it on audiobook, so can't really check at the moment. But yeah, I'd recommend it. And then probably one of my favorites so far was A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. Last year I read A Short History of Nearly Everything, and you get a little bit of a taste of its humor in there, but it's mainly just sticking to the facts. This one has a whole lot more personality, and I loved it for it. So I'm in Virginia. Shenandoah is back in my backyard. And I love the Appalachian Trail. So this one really hit home for me. And I will say Bryson in this book complains a lot, but that's almost like part of his charm. But if you're the type of person that complaining kind of grates on you, I'd say it's probably best to steer clear. But what's really cool is it intermingles facts about the trail, facts about nature, and like his personal memoir in between all of that, and creates a really interesting, coherent timeline of events. I enjoyed it a lot. Then we get to Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. So this is my third or fourth book by him, so there'll be another video coming up kind of as my entirety of thoughts on the author and everything. To summarize, Talking to Strangers is kind of like all about misinterpreting the real motives in interactions. And I think that'd be a really good topic on its own, but given the sensitivity of some of what he talks about, like Sandra Bland's arrest and sequential suicide, and the Sandusky case, and touchy subjects like that, I feel like applying that reductionist aspect almost felt like he was trying to make an excuse for the police officer that caused the arrest and suicide for Sandra Bland, or pedophilia, or a lot of these other things that it kind of should have maybe stayed away from. Like, don't get me wrong, the sociology part of it and the psychology between how the brain works, how we jump to conclusions, and how we misinterpret each other, really good. I think you could use less touchy examples and maybe come across in a different manner when portraying those. But again, more in another video. All in all, it was an interesting read. It's a quintessential Gladwell. It was easy to get through. Yeah. Then we had Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. Now, this was something that was recommended to me by a viewer way back on my first video, and I finally got around to it. This was a really, really solid book. It reminded me of Factfulness by Hans Rosling. Basically, the world is in a better off spot than what we think it is, and here's 1,200 statistical analyses of why this is true. I like this more than Factfulness because it dove into a wider breadth of topics. Touched on nuclear war, to disease, to I think artificial intelligence, and everything in between. Again, super engaging. No chapter kind of felt like it was going on too long. And I think for a 400-page book, that's all you can ask. It's actually so good, I've actually loaned it out already to somebody else, even though I read it physically. Then we had Surely You're Joking, Mr. Fineman by Richard Fineman. I read this on audiobook. It's fun. Basically is a sequence of tales of quirky interactions and what he's learned along the way, from when he was a child to on the Manhattan Project to thereafter learning random skills and playing bongos. I will say it kind of can come off a little egotistical at times, because it's here's a story about how great I am, here's a story about how I fooled people, here's a story about how great I am, kind of back to back to back. But it didn't really bother me. I just kind of noticed it as a trend. I'd recommend it. It's a fun read. And then finally, read The Body by Bill Bryson. So it's his newest work. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it felt more like A Short History of Nearly Everything than it did A Walk in the Woods. After I read A Walk in the Woods, I really kind of fell in love with his humor and his complaining attitude in a way, kind of dry. But this drew all the way back and was only facts about the body. I say that as if it's a bad thing. It just lacked a little bit of the charm I read in the last book. But as a unit in a vacuum, it was a really good book. Jumped all the way from like the mind and how the brain works to the skin to lungs to immune system to everything in between. Lots of random off the wall facts. Was fun, was engaging, did not read like a textbook. It read very similar to A Short History of Nearly Everything, where it had a wide breadth of topics, not too deep on any, and then had anecdotes, is that right? Where it jumped off to stories that tied into those topics, whether that was how X was discovered or how Y was proven right or what have you. All in all, just a really fun read. But yeah, that wraps up what I've got read so far this year. Got a pretty big TBR for what's coming on down the road. I am reading by topic, so you can expect videos on life extension, on death, videos by author, and that's kind of something I'm really looking forward to. If you have any suggestions on what you want me to cover, drop those below. In the meantime, subscribe if you haven't already. I'm kind of blown away that we're at like 700 now. I think the last time I made a video we were approaching 500. So yeah, I love the social pressure. You guys keep me going. Until next time, see ya.